We have a very distinguished set of panelists joining us today, and we're delighted to have all of you here as well. So a little over a year ago, the Global Commission on Adaptation came to its planned conclusion with a global climate adaptation summit in January of 2021. And at that summit, a number of principles for locally led adaptation were announced, along with 30 or 40 organizations and countries that had come together and said, we endorse these principles. They represent what we want to achieve in terms of supporting locally led adaptation action. Today, we're taking the time a little bit a year later to reflect on, well, what's changed since that moment in time when these principles were developed and announced and an original set of organizations and countries endorsed them. We're going to be reflecting on how have they been put into practice, what has changed, and trying to capture some of those stories very tangibly about what is different as a result of these principles and what is still a challenge. What do we need to tackle, learn more about, learn from each other, work creatively to resolve? Because this is not easy work. We recognize that. And we invite all of the organizations on this call, all of you, to endorse these principles and be part of a community of practice and learning, which over time will be coming together, especially at Gobeshona every year, to reflect on what we've learned, what's working well, what's not, and as this is new, learning together. So with that open invitation to all of you to be part of the community of practice that was kicked off at the Climate Adaptation Summit and indeed began before it with the action track on locally led adaptation. We're going to continue this journey together. And to kick us off, I'd like to turn to my colleague May at IIED to tell us about the principles for locally led adaptation. So if you don't know what they are, you'll get a little bit of a briefing on them from May. May, over to you.
Okay. What can you see right now? Can you see my screen?
Yes. We can see your screen, but it's not in presentation mode yet.
Presentation mode. What about
now? It's in presentation mode.
Okay.
And we see your title slide.
Excellent. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining the session. Christina has already mentioned a couple of things, the LLA principles, endorsement. So I will cover a couple of different things so that you can have a refresher on these things if you're not already familiar with what they are. So yeah, my name is May Zeal, and I'm a climate finance researcher at IIED. So I will give you a small background on what the LLA principles are. So within the current climate crisis that we have today, there is a strong recognition that this is supposed to be a global effort, a whole of society effort, where everybody is involved in climate change adaptation and trying to work towards climate goals. And IIED and WRI, we strongly believe that there should be greater power and resources needed for local actors. And we are not alone in this belief. And so the Global Commission on Adaptations, locally led adaptation action track is behind these principles. And within this context have developed the locally led adaptation principles. And so these were not developed by IIED and WRI alone. They were co-developed with over 50 organizations from a range of different backgrounds, so grassroots, bilateral, donors, intermediaries, international NGOs, and who came up with these principles for locally led adaptation, which were launched at the 2001 January Climate Adaptation Summit. So we have a vision of a 10-year learning journey for promoting the locally led adaptation principles and promoting resilience. So this is the second year in our learning journey. As Christina mentioned before, there is an active community of practice that has been in close consultation and dialogues, and their objective is to promote these LLA principles. So the idea with the community of practice is to share the experiences on locally led adaptation, promote learning, and as well expand the number of endorsements and also increase commitment to the LLA principles. So this is the second year, as I mentioned, and Gobeshona is one of the events that we see as an opportunity to promote these principles. We have a couple of other events planned this year with others in the community of practice, which include the MENA Climate Action Week. We have an event later this week, which we can share with you in the chat. We also have other events like the London Climate Action Week and the Development and Climate Days around the time of COP. So there will be several different events throughout the year to promote the LLA principles and share our learning. So you might be wondering what the 8 principles that we talk about are. So very briefly, I will walk them through with you. The first is the principle of devolving decision-making to the lowest appropriate level. So this is the recognition that local institutions should have more decision-making power in adaptation action and also access to finance. The second principle is on addressing structural inequalities faced by people of marginalized backgrounds. So this is a principle that believes that decision-making power should be in the hands of those that are traditionally marginalized, and that adaptation action should address structural inequalities. The next principle is on providing patient and predictable funding that can be accessed more readily. So all too often, funding is inconsistent. Many local organizations are unsure of how long the funding can last. It's very unpredictable. So this principle believes that there should be long-term and predictable financing that's not going to run out very unexpectedly, and that it should be easy to access. Principle 4 is on investing in local capacities to leave an institutional legacy. So this believes that there should be strengthening capacity of local actors in the long run so that they can lead in adaptation action without external input and facilitation. On principle 5 is on building a robust understanding of climate risk and uncertainty. So we believe that adaptation actions should take into account a range of different climate information. This includes traditional and local knowledge, as well as science-based knowledge. The next principle is on flexible programming and learning. The adaptation actions should be based on flexible programming so that it responds to the needs of local actors. It should be responsive and not onerous on local communities' needs. The next is on ensuring transparency and accountability. We believe that there should be a principle of downward accountability, and that designing, financing, and implementing programs should be as transparent as possible to local actors. And last but not least is the principle of collaborative action and investment. All too often approaches are very siloed, and we really believe that locally led adaptation should be collaborative, should be inclusive, and prevent siloed approaches. So we have talked about endorsement before. So if you really believe that these principles are something that resonate very strongly with you, there is an opportunity to endorse, and over 70 different organizations have endorsed these principles so far. And there are a wide range of different organizations that have endorsed these principles, ranging from climate funds, international NGOs, bilateral donors. We have a wonderful set of representatives from some of these organizations that have endorsed here today with us as panelists. So if you are interested, there's a short form that you can fill out and then email one of these on the email or email myself. And of course, we're welcome. We can talk more to talk about endorsement and what these principles mean. This is just a preview of some of the organizations that have endorsed. And without further ado, I can hand it back to Christina so we can have a discussion from the panelists.
Thank you so much, May, for providing that overview and introduction to the principles, which might be new material for some people joining today. So we wanted to take the time to do that. But also just to say that by endorsing the principles, you become part of a community of practice and learning, and a supportive community of practice and learning, I might add, to join in this journey together. So it's not that everything is on your own shoulders to figure out how to do. And so part of our objective today with this panel, which you'll hear from shortly, is to reflect on, in the time since the principles have been released, what's changed, what's working well, what still needs further work so that we can tackle it together. And so we do invite everyone to be part of that community and part of that journey together. So for this panel, we're going to hear from a variety of speakers from different points of society and social change to hear why they endorsed, what that endorsement has looked like, what's changed, what's been challenging, and what the plans are looking forward. So I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker. He's Ambassador Ken O'Flaherty, who is the COP26 Regional Ambassador from Asia for Asia Pacific and South Asia. He was appointed to this role in March of 2020 in the lead up to COP26. Previously, he was Deputy Head of Mission in Rome from August 2015 to October 2019. He's held a number of different appointments with the Foreign Office as a career diplomat, including UK representation to the European Union, and has worked on a wide range of issues from EU cooperation to security, counterterrorism, migration, economic and energy issues in the Middle East. And I'm sure there's a lot that we can learn from those topics as well. Ambassador O'Flaherty, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christina. It's a pleasure, of course, to be joining you at Gobeshona and seeing so many friends and esteemed colleagues with us today. And it's particularly special to be talking about locally led adaptation, which is a particular priority for the UK. And of course, you need to move beyond simple endorsements of principles towards real accountability and implementation. And I'm particularly pleased that we have the connection to Bangladesh. I visited Bangladesh twice in my role as COP26 ambassador, and I think there's a lot to learn from their response to climate impacts and the pioneering approach that Bangladesh has taken to early warning systems in the south, for example, or the use of floating schools in the north. And I think these innovative forms of adapting are the kinds of actions we need to embrace, we need to take further as we're trying to tackle the most wicked challenges of climate change. Now, the IPCC, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say absolutely, and just to ask a note that the UK was one of the first countries to endorse the principles, and indeed very helpful in securing other endorsements and elevating this in the lead up to COP26. I'd love to hear why the UK found it important to endorse these principles and engage in this process.
Well, I think we have no time to lose, and this is clearly one of the biggest challenges that face us in the whole climate change policy arena. We had the IPCC Vulnerability, Impacts and Adaptation report published just last month, and that gave really quite a sobering message that within our lifetimes, the impacts of climate change are going to grow in force and in ferocity to, quite frankly, quite terrifying levels. And we're clear that adaptation action to date just has not been sufficient to keep pace with the growing impacts, and they've been exacerbating existing inequalities and existing injustices. But we're also clear that we have a choice. There is another clear message from the report that the future is not written. The change that comes about is still within our control. We know how to build a more climate resilient society. We know how to protect people, to protect economies, ecosystems, but that requires transformation of how we adapt. We need to be tackling underlying vulnerabilities, and we need to be giving greater agency and autonomy to women, girls, Indigenous peoples, young people, people with disabilities to respond to those climate risks. So, of course, as you've mentioned, we're lucky enough to have the COP26 presidency over the last 2 years. We've been working with partner organizations, including many here today, and we've been trying to champion locally led adaptation consistently as a more effective, more equitable, and a more inclusive approach. And through the regional dialogues, which we convened with grassroots organizations, we've heard firsthand the challenges and the opportunities to further locally led adaptation. Now, we were thrilled that at Glasgow, at COP26, we were able to hear directly from local adapters speaking to their experiences. We, as you say, adopted and endorsed the principles for locally led adaptation very early last year, and we were very pleased other donor countries welcomed those principles, notably through the G7 meetings that we chaired as we were concurrently G7 presidency. And it was great to see so many other climate providers and recipient countries also endorse those principles at Glasgow. Now, I don't know if you would like me to talk a bit about the next steps and what we want to do next. Would that be helpful?
Yeah, where do we go from here? We're at
Sure.
a very pivotal moment, as you mentioned. So what's ahead?
Sure. Well, I think we now need to move from the political intent stage to meaningful action. And so at Glasgow, we published the Glasgow Imperative, in fact, just before COP26, and that outlined some priority actions to close the adaptation gap and respond to climate impacts. Locally led adaptation was very much at the core of that imperative, and it includes genuine participatory planning involving frontline communities in decision-making, working with state and non-state actors to empower communities and give them greater autonomy. And I think very importantly, delivering improved access to climate finance at the local level. At Glasgow, we announced a suite of programs aimed at improving frontline communities' participation in adaptation projects and enable access to climate finance. For an example, we announced support for regional programs like the Africa Regional Climate and Nature Programme, or ARCAN, and the Community Resilience Partnership Programme, which aims to help Asia and the Pacific countries scale up investments in climate action. We also announced support to the LDC initiative for effective adaptation and resilience program for another 5 years to continue to deliver on the LDC vision 2050. And just last week at a Life AR launch event, we established 12 pilot models, or rather they were announced, taking forward a model of decentralized climate finance across different districts in Uganda. And that should ensure that 70% of international climate finance flows to the local level, so that the needs of the local communities most impacted by climate change are met. Now, I mentioned access to finance, and I know this is a particular priority for countries such as Bangladesh. And we've announced £100 million of UK support to the task force on access to finance. And that task force will be giving capital grants to climate vulnerable countries to support delivery of their national climate plans. And there's 5 countries which will be trialing a new approach in cooperation with providers of climate finance. Those include Bangladesh, Fiji, Jamaica, Uganda, and Rwanda. And those initial country and demand-led trials will be seeing finance providers test, model, and champion new methods for accessing climate finance. We're also trying to build capacity in country and providing seed corn funding to the Resilience Adaptation Mainstreaming Programme, which should be developing a global university network to provide training and services to central government ministries, but also build local capacity for adaptation planning. Universities in Bangladesh are part of that programme. And finally, through the Catalyst programme, we're also taking forward recommendations on adaptation planning and access to finance to bridge the gap between adaptation planning and adaptation action. And that should help improve funding flows to specific countries' adaptation priorities. So I think COP26 for us was a clear moment to amplify work on locally led adaptation, and the leadership that so many local adapters are showing. And now I think it's for governments, for multilateral development banks, and for non-state actors to improve their support for locally led adaptation while also enhancing that access to finance. Thanks.
Fantastic, and thank you so much for your leadership. It's great to hear the different entry points, the different levels of engagement, universities, governments, but also systemic changes in terms of translating adaptation planning into action and really making sure that it reaches and supports frontline communities and tackles some of the hard issues around access to climate finance. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions for you, so we'll come back to those in just a second. I'd love to turn to our next panelist, Sarah Allen. She's the Global Climate Change Partnership Advisor for Save the Children and is also a founding member of the Localization Task Force. Sarah started her career in Deutsche Bank in New York and worked for HSBC, Barclays, Ernst & Young in London. She made the transition to international development following a sabbatical in Lebanon where she was learning Arabic and was working with national actors on refugee response. And I'm including all of this detail because I feel like it's important to hear people's journeys. And I particularly thought this bit was important, that it was in Lebanon where Sarah experienced firsthand the creativity and brilliance of local civil society. Sarah, thank you for joining us today. So Save the Children was one of the very first large international NGOs that endorsed the principles for locally led adaptation. And I must admit, I was a little surprised as a child-focused organization that you were able to jump on these principles and champion them so consistently since the very beginning. I'd love to hear a little bit from you as to why the principles were important for Save the Children.
Thanks so much, Christina, and for inviting me on this panel, and also huge thanks to all those at IIED for getting Gobeshona off the ground so soon after COP26. It's just, I'm in awe of their ability to mobilize, get people together. It's really quite phenomenal what one organization and its stakeholders in Bangladesh are able to do. I think first and foremost, the answer is because of children and young people. I'm sure many of us here today on the panel, in the audience, have been privileged over the last year since these principles were endorsed to hear children and young people talk about, the systemic injustices, about the architecture of international aid, of the lack of demand-driven adaptation funding that goes into their communities, both in the so-called global south or indeed in the global north as well. Children and young people can speak more eloquently, with more understanding, with more knowledge than I ever imagined before having heard some of these children speak. So children really understand this. They really have the answers and solution, both people under 18 and also obviously the sort of adolescent contingent and young people. And so for us, wanting to represent children as our sort of the first and foremost kind of constituent that we're accountable for, that if we hadn't have been signing these, children would be holding us to account, like they are holding all of the sort of ecosystem of funders and donors and INGOs. So I think just sort of being in solidarity with children, because actually they really know what they're talking about when it comes to this kind of thing, and they really understand those injustices. So I guess that's first and foremost why we signed them. But when it comes to our programming and thinking about our adaptation programming, we were recently, before endorsing the principles, had become accredited with the Green Climate Fund, that we're among many of you advocating for that organization to endorse principles as well. But just thinking about, as we're designing our adaptation program, having these principles and being able to use those principles, internally with our offices and internally to really have those as the bedrock of our adaptation programming as well. And I guess the third reason would be that not long before endorsing the principles, we'd got signed off our first ever, long overdue, I must say, our first ever cross-organizational localization policy. And I think some of these principles already really resonate in terms of the way we're working, but some of those principles, we have work to do in order to really be able to meaningfully say that we're implementing them.
And so what's changed since you've put in place this localization program and endorsed the principles? Just some tangible nuggets of either mindset shifts you've seen, or policies that have changed, or even individual actions or individual relationships that have shifted somehow.
Yes, so since the policy was signed off, we our 2022 strategy sort of goes until 2024. One of our main pillars, it sounds a little bit pretentious, doesn't it, when I say the word pillar? One of our main pillars of that strategy is shifting power to communities and children closest to, the crises and where they live. And just having that, nailed on in our strategy for the first time, that sets the agenda at the top, that this is something that is no longer a nice to have. And we did have good pockets of work. Our Scandinavian members, for example, have long had good practice in this, but it wasn't sort of globally recognized as like, actually, if we want to amplify impact for children and really be meaningfully be accountable to them, if we don't do this, then we're failing for children. And I think that having that recognition from the top, for me, of coming from not only working on climate adaptation programming, but also in the localization task team, it's really significant, because that means that we can start making changes to our policies, our procedures, our business development, our program design. I would say that those things can take quite a long time. We're very much in the process now of making some of those changes, looking at our partnerships. I think when it comes to partnerships, moving away from those sort of contractual, transactional partnerships that we might put in place, or a consortium to deliver a program aligned to our sort of back donor, but actually thinking about those partnerships much more strategically, and making sure that what those partners want are fed in and we're led by them. So I think the mindset, the cultural shift is taking time. I'm very impatient. I'm like, come on, let's get off mural board and, the sticky notes telling us what we need to do, and let's start moving away from that and seeing those ways of working actually happen. So yeah, I think this is the main change last year. And this year, I think, like Ambassador Ken and others said, it's about moving away from the goodwill and the intent and start delivering action.
And so you've alluded to some challenges and some things that still need to be tackled, and I'd love to hear what those are, to the extent that you're willing to share, and what is challenging about implementing some of these principles.
Yeah, I was looking through the principles again this morning, and I thought I would just pick up on one, which from my sort of localization, and this is across all contexts, humanitarian development, including climate hat on, and also from the adaptation program design I'm working on with the Green Climate Fund. I think Principle 6 on flexible programming and learning is one where I think we at Save the Children have got more to do on that, but I think maybe as a sector as well, because so much of what we do when we're sort of putting together programs and we're responding to the sort of framework and the sort of specificities of a specific donor, we're then finding and taking partnerships, some of those hopefully local. But when you're talking about true flexible funding, that's got to be demand driven. It's got to be partners saying, well, actually, we don't need a child protection specialist here. What we need is someone to help on our compliance framework. We actually need someone to help in our communications. We need business development. These are the things that the sort of nuts and bolts of organizations to help them to grow, to help them become climate finance ready in this case. And I think there's a little bit of a sort of gap to plug, finding that flexible funding and making it available. And that requires a mindset shift, both at Save the Children, to actually have that funding so it goes above and beyond a specific program where your objectives are almost tied to the donor, And I think that one is one where we say we want to do it, demand-driven, flexible funding, but the how, I think, still eludes us, if I'm being honest.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure you're not alone in that, Sarah. That flexibility, when your deliverables are prescribed, many years in advance, perhaps before delivery, and you just don't necessarily have that flexibility to say, no, what we actually need is not child protection. We need, X, Y, and Z, or what have you. Well, thank you for sharing that. And again, I'd be curious to hear from those in the audience if you similarly found challenge in providing that flexibility and making the fund truly demand-driven. Sarah, do you want to give us any preview of what you're doing going forward?
Yeah, so going forward, I think the great thing about the principles, I think for me personally as a champion of these on an individual level, is that we have these principles, we can take them to lots of different parts of our organization, talk them, discuss them, workshop them. So one thing I want to try and do is just to make sure that new people that are coming on board in different countries, and we work in quite a few different places, so using those principles as a real starting point to, okay, let's get this right first time, let's think about these before the program is funded and right at the outset of the program. So really thinking about how we can make them work in different contexts, thinking that maybe if we're programming in Somalia, it might look different to Nepal, that might look different to Vanuatu, in fact, where we do have a program soon to be launched there, where it's more local government there. There is a little civil society in Vanuatu. So I think just thinking about contextually those differences and how we can apply them. And and I think there's a lot going on in terms of our partnership review and actually looking to see how we can really, walk the talk or walk the walk, not just talk the talk when it comes to localization.
And I'm sure there's a lot to do to walk the talk, as it were. Great. Well, I want to turn to our third panelist to bring in Kazi Ahmad Dulhak, who is the Senior Director for Strategic Planning and Head of Climate Action for Friendship NGO. Kazi is overseeing quality control and continued development of Friendship's programming, as well as transformational leadership for better life through collaboration with community, public, and private sectors. Takes a very holistic approach. He's worked for various organizations, including Save the Children, UNICEF, USAID, and others in his extensive career, and has published extensively as well, including on issues of education, counseling for adolescents, and has received 2 gold medal awards, I might add, from Chittagong University.
No, stop.
Okay, I'll move on. But thank you so much, Kazi, for joining us and for bringing us visually into the communities that you work with. I also must say, Friendship NGO was the very first organization to endorse the principles, something for which I am personally very thankful for and will never forget, because I was so excited to receive that first endorsement. But would love to hear from you, from your perspective. Why did you endorse these principles, and what's changed in how you've been working in the year or so since you first endorsed the principles?
Okay, thank you, Christina. Thank you for your kind words and appreciation. And first of all, am I audible properly?
Perfectly for me.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I'm truly grateful. I express my gratitude to Ambassador Khan, referring the Bangladesh visit and our adaptation practices. Truly, when we face challenges, that makes us creative. So our people, both in rural and urban, every corner of the country, they are very much creative to fight with the multiple disaster hazards, climate change. And I was listening, Sarah, my old organization, Save the Children, and I was remembering a event. Our children, are the mostly. I'll get back to you with the elderly things, and then let me tell you the children's story. That is, our children are truly very traumatized. The first victims or the significant victims for the because of climate change or disasters and everything. We hardly notice that. We do care for our relief, response, rehabilitation, adaptation, but very silent and very critically children are suffering. So we wanted how really, but the speeches, workshop, conference, symposium, not really applicable for children. How really we can minimize those trauma and how really we can prepare them for future challenges.
Yeah.
We introduced a rhymes book for children, and the rhymes book, had different type of situation and consequence and how to handle, how to take care, how to adapt with the situation, and that worked as huge. And these children, each and everywhere they used to play with rhymes and they perform, they made their own role play. And we invited to them in the national level a program, National Disaster Preparedness Day observation in the capital city. And 60% of those children never been in city. They came to the big stage and they performed with those rhymes. And that gave a big shake to the minister and secretaries, all the big officials and stakeholders. Then we realized, yes, they also can be our ambassador for tomorrow. And if we really find the real tool, so that our adaptation fighting, challenges, they can take over. And that is, we never knew they have many creative ideas, innovation. They have,
Absolutely.
they
And what a
know.
great
So
illustration
that
of
I was remembering those children when Sarah was speaking. Yes, our children is truly
local
our future, and
innovation.
we need to think, we need to invest more and more for those children.
Yeah.
And now coming back to your local adaptation friendship, is 20 years journey. Aruna Khan, founder of the friendship, when started this journey, we are working. She was started working with the disaster victims, and now realize all those are climate victims. And so for the day one, our 100% working area is the climate impacted. So for the day one, we had to struggle. We had to manage how to adapt with the local situation. The challenges, these people we are working for seems like excluded people. And, they're far from city and difficult communication, difficult transportation, hard to reach, away from mainstream, uncertainty, everything is there. But we didn't give up. But we realized that traditional donors, or the conventional donors, they are not happy with this, uncertainty. They need a graphical chart, a fixed time frame, 3 years, 5 years project, and this level of growth, this level of investment. And you can't manage this formula with these people. And this not, in around 30, 40 million people, both in coastal and shore areas, Sandbar Island, struggling, facing this uncertainty. And then friendship, actually, our own Friendship International and different friendship entity, they are raising fund for us. So that actually helped us to support these people, to reach these people with flexibility. And then we realize, because the way we work, very difficult to continue if we don't get the support from the local community and local government.
Mm-hmm.
And all those our practices, we find a reflection with the LLA principles. LLA principles, nothing but a pathway, and actually structured our thinking and structured our way forward. And that's why we realize that's the very important tool we need to take forward. And that motivated us. And now we realize when days gone, each and every principle has some byproduct. I can explain later. You were asking something.
Well, I was just going to ask, so you mentioned the principles sort of structured, and I'd love to hear, so what's changed? What do you mean by the principles structured and each principle as a byproduct? Briefly, if you can, because we need to get to discussion and questions.
Initially, the way we used to work, the community used to prepare their own adaptation plan, own risk reduction plan, right? And but whole plan, we need some assistance, support from local government or other government agencies, some NGOs. Community need contribution from them too. And then from that, we shifted how really, and at the same time, from the same community, local government preparing their own plan. And we built a bridge. The community prepared their plan, we connected community with the local government, and then local government incorporated those plans into their plan.
Mm-hmm.
So there are some level of decision making local government taking. Some level, maybe local level infrastructure, little roads, some culverts, some little bridges, this, that. So they have their own mandate, own way they're doing. And in many cases, we found them disconnected from the community, but the chairperson or the councillor has his own plan, own vision. When community came up with them with their own recommended suggestion, idea, plan in a structured way, then local government realized, oh my God, we need vote for the next year. So we can't ignore them. We need to accept them. And that took time. It took time, few years. But gradually, they also realized that also helping us. These people helping us to identify the real challenges, to identify the priorities.
Mm-hmm.
And that actually, and byproduct is doing this practice. Initially, they thought, oh, that's great. We are getting them into our, board, getting them into our support. So we have to do something. But if we comply and if we agree with their plan, that would help as a win-win situation.
Mm-hmm.
But the byproduct is transparency. Byproduct is mobilizing local resources. Byproduct is, transparency, because when you're sharing your plan, when you are changing your plan, so you somehow, you somehow unfolding your resources, you somehow unfolding your ability, you unfolding your responsibility, so that you are transparency taking place.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, they can investment point of view, whatever the resources they have local level, they find the right option to invest. And what we do, we invest our resources to build their capacity, how to prepare a plan, how to conduct an assessment, how to prioritize, and what really help them to be more popular, and what really help them to be, more acceptable to the community. That mutual. But there are some challenges remain, and definitely I will explain those challenges later when you ask me.
Great. Well, we're going to go to Q&A from the audience and also invite Q&A from other panelists in a second, but we do want to hear those challenges, Kazi. So if you could bring those into the discussion, that would be great. I'm going to turn over to May. I think we have a couple questions coming in, but by all means, I do encourage those of you watching at home to put your questions or raise your hand. We can unmute you and let you have your say and ask your question, because this really should be a discussion. May, over to you.
Thank you, panelists, so much for your responses so far. And it's been really interesting to hear about how the principles have guided internal strategies, how it has had more impact for an external strategy, and also how it has built capacity or has actually clarified some thinking of what you're already doing, as Kazi was saying. So there is a question from the audience. Do we know what the endorsers are doing differently from having endorsed the principles? So what I'll do, I think, is give you a minute each to respond. So would you like to go first, Ken O'Flaherty?
Sure, very happy to. I think 3 quick points. I think one would be we know we have to be understanding better, learning from the civil society organizations, from grassroots organizations, to understand best practice in different contexts. I think Sarah touched on that a bit in her intervention. And the second point would be reviewing our own long-term planning, program planning, not just on climate, but more widely, to understand how locally led approaches can be embedded more broadly in UK aid programming. And finally, I think we have mentioned working with recipient countries, but we're also determined to be working with donors more widely, learning from their approaches, of course, but also seeing how collectively we can streamline approaches to financing, seeking to overcome the barriers that may exist, of course, with continuing due diligence. Thanks.
Thank you very much for those concise points. Over to you, Sarah, if you'd like to respond.
Yeah, so a couple of things we're doing differently. So one, when it comes to our program design on climate, community-based, community-led adaptation programs, is just doing the designs differently to how we've done before, working very much at the lowest administrative level, local or subnational governments, and indeed getting children to participate as well in the designs, and local civil society, and taking the time to really meaningfully engage and listen and be driven by the needs of local communities in a more intentional way than perhaps before the principles were signed. The second thing, when it comes to some of our larger adaptation programs, is when it comes to implementation, Save the Children is going to step back and not be the main implementer for some of these programs, but actually really get local governments and civil society to take the reins on implementation, and Save the Children, where possible, stepping back and maybe providing more of that technical assistance rather than direct delivery. And then the third thing is just having these principles has really helped, I think. We can do more for sure, but thinking about our advocacy and influencing and what we can do to take these principles, and I'm on the program side, but working more closely with colleagues in the influencing and policy space, so we can make sure that other donors throughout our federation that might not have signed them, that we can take those and get more endorsers, particularly funders.
Thank you. Those sound like very concrete steps. Kazi?
If I add my point, that is, yes, we are do things locally, but you wanted to that learning to influence in nationally. So that, last two round we have completed, and we invited the local government chairperson and local NGOs in Dhaka, capital city. And this year in October, and last year in October, we conducted this, and from 20 high vulnerable districts. And then in front of them, the 5 ministry people, ministers, secretaries, and director generals, directors took seat. And we act as a facilitator only. We invited them to speak, to proceed for a dialogue, and what they're doing local level, and what the crisis they're facing, what the challenges they're facing. And the national policymakers, the ministers, secretaries, they clarified what the policy exists, interpretation of the policy, those things. So we realize, that those learning what we do at a remote community level, if we can bring those learning at national level, maybe some national issues and some national level decision can be redefined. Decision making always remain with the secretariat or the minister level or the capital level. If they can decentralize those decisions, this type of dialogue really helps. Last few years we are doing this, we'll continue. That is one thing. And sometimes really honestly, the minister and the secretaries, they had no clue, they had no idea these things are happening and these things remain. So sometimes it's helping them to also to think differently. And sometimes the local people had no clue, no idea that there's some policy exists, the provision exists, but they didn't know because of the in between the huge gap and huge transit. Is one thing. And second thing, I'm sure, I don't know, Christina or all other, we write some articles in newspaper during COP, few articles published, on the importance of local adaptation with some examples, and we clarified why it's really needed. So beyond our day-to-day implementation, we also trying to spread this idea and mobilize the different stakeholders to be part of this, because until and unless the donor community or government taking part in this movement or in this initiative, very difficult to take it forward.
Thank you very much, Kazi. I see that, Golem, you have a question. We're running very quickly out of time. So if you could ask your question quickly and then direct it at which panelist that you want a response from. I know Ambassador O'Flaherty has to leave exactly in 5 minutes. So please be quick, and thank you for your question.
Thank you so much, Mayor. This is Ghulam Rabbani from Climate Bridge Fund Secretariat at BRAC. Well, I was actually wondering, two major elements in this 8 principles. The first element is policy alignment. When we design a project, at the local level, we often try to, engage the local communities and discuss with them. But at the same time, we need to align with the local master plan, local policy, and national policy plans. And this is also extremely important when you relate to the climate action 13 SDG goals. So you need to integrate the adaptation measures into the policy. So is this policy alignment issue is inbuilt in the principle 1? That is my first question. And my second question is the monitoring aspect of any adaptation actions, locally led adaptation action. So I was thinking whether this monitoring aspect is again inbuilt with the principle 6 or not. So these 2 questions to you. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Would any of the panelists like to respond to that? The first question is on policy alignment, and then the second question is on monitoring and evaluation in the principle 6 on, what is principle 6? On flexible programming. Yes.
Should I?
Yeah, please go ahead, Kazi.
Okay, Rabbani Bhai is Ghulam Rabbani. He is a very known climate activist in country and known in the world in different climate forums. So that he knows very well the challenges remain, and he's truly identified 2 significant points. One, the first point, the local the policy conflict with policy. That's why I mentioned the some challenges remain. And that's why our policymakers need to know what the critical situation. And one prescription can't fit for everyone, every community in the country. So that's true. That's remain, and that's why I believe the demonstration and examples, if we can take forward, then that may help the local policymaker to adapt and adjust with the changes and with the situation. And that's true. And at the same time, there are some brilliant initiative already in place. In Bangladesh, the local level, some disaster management committee exists, but we yet to form any agenda for the climate adaptation issues. I believe the National Adaptation Plan, which is really in progress at this moment, will capture those things. And that challenge remain. And the second one, what's the monitoring action? Yes, if you, I believe that Christina, if you share the detail of the LLA principles and implementation, you will find some monitoring design will already exist. But yes, always room for improvement always remain. And that also a big challenge, how to monitor the adaptation plan. There are plenty schools of thought, and at the same time, National Adaptation Policy and National Plan are trying to capture some monitoring mechanism and framework. And but at this moment, LLA has some direction and some indicators how to proceed with these 8 principles. I believe in chat box, if you share the site so that he will get access. And definitely we welcome everyone to contribute for improvement in future. Thank you, Rabbani Bhai, for joining with us.
Absolutely. I'll share those links again, but just to say, developing an accountability, a mutual accountability system that's top down and bottom up is very much a priority and something that is to be co-developed by the community of practice. So we encourage everyone to engage in that process with us. I know that some of our panelists have to drop off in another minute, so thank you very much for joining us, to Ambassador O'Flaherty and others that might need to drop off, participants and panelists. But I want to give a final word to Sheila Patel. So Sheila needs no introduction, but I must say Sheila has been the ardent champion along with Dr. Musa, along with Salim Haq of this issue as part of the Global Commission, as an ambassador for the Global Commission on Adaptation. And I'd love to hear your reflections, Sheila, having been part of this journey from the beginning. What do you see that has changed since we started? And what's still ahead of us? What do we still need to focus on from your perspective? Sheila, over to you.
It's been a fascinating discussion, and I think we need to have more discussions like this between these large events and not just leave it to these large events. I think each and every speaker, first of all, brought out amazing insights on specifics. And so first of all, what the speaker said brought to my realization that we are talking about 5 to 6 levels of resource providers and utilizers, from grassroots communities to global institutions. And there's very little conversation between them. So we talk about top down and bottom up, but we don't talk about how these conversations have to be created to produce the opening of the knots that stop the flow of money. So for instance, if Ken was here, I would say, I'd love to have him talk to the different departments of FCDO and look at the challenges they face. Because, the issues of compliance, the issues of managing and mitigating risks automatically exclude provision of funds to local groups. It's a known fact. And I think that's one area of a lot of work. And therefore, my first thought was that these different levels have to be in the same room talking together to look at how does the flow of information and the flow of decision-making and reporting and managing of risks and all these things that we are talking about get discussed together.
Yeah.
Because I think that is what is our next role. Because on one hand, you have the challenges of non-flow. On the other hand, you have the tragedy of non-utilization. You have inadequate resources being allotted to climate change for adaptation, and a pitiful amount that actually goes to communities. And anybody who knows finance will tell you that those who manage finance within those institutions will look at your last year's utilization, and they will give you budgets in relationship to your ability to produce absorption. So you don't look at why the money didn't flow, but you do look at ways by which then you make adjustments that are convenient to give money where the money flows quickly and not to money which is needed urgently and critically. And I think we need to, with all the groups that are within us, Sarah said it very well about what are the challenges they face. Like this, in each level, we need to do that. The other very important thing, which are for us to look at the larger issues that also impact us, and it's something that Salim said in one of his amazing weekly write-ups that he does as blogs, where he says science must inform choices that we make for adaptation. And when you say science, it's not only science that acknowledges traditional and cultural knowledge and confirms it and celebrates it, but also brings it new knowledge that produces adaptation investments that are not only good for right away, but future. So you can't talk about resilience building if you don't bring this knowledge. And there isn't enough investment in knowledge creation and science that is working for adaptation. There's a lot more doing in the private sector than it is in the public domain. So I think that's another very big issue for me. And the third thing, which is a suggestion which comes out of my own practice, for those of you who don't know, I'm part of a global network called STI. We work with small grassroots groups in 33 countries, and we're perpetually looking for funds that communities can drive. And what we find as a good startup is to create a modest fund, Sarah, you should try that. A modest amount of money that is available to be locally driven, which you monitor beautifully and well, and that you ensure that every single good and bad thing about it is not treated as a punishment, but as a learning. Because we don't like to know bad news, so we never understand why things go wrong. And when we don't know when things go wrong, we always blame the weakest part of the link, which is the community in today's environment. So I see these as important things for us to do in this coming year, Christina. And let's work out a way by which every single organization that is here with us, having signed off on this, shares these vignettes, shares processes, challenges that opened doors. You know, we need to learn from each other. If we don't know examples, we don't know things that worked or didn't work, we're going to get stuck in this place.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's carve our next agenda with amazing good things that friendship has done. And thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. It actually talks about the people who matter. And I think that the last thing I want to say is for my friend Rabbani, when you say that it should align with the policies, well, my friend, in most of the countries that you know very well and I know very well, the policies are not inclusive of very vulnerable people's rights and entitlements. I don't know so much about rural, but I can tell you in urban areas, 20 to 60% people live informally, and they do not have policies that allow resources to go to them from state and international agencies if you were to only follow policies. So we also need policy reform to produce access. So I want to end there, and thank you so much, Christina, for calling me.
Oh no, thank you, Sheila. This was fantastic. I know we're gonna have to wrap up in a second. Sorry, my computer did something weird there. I thought we were being wrapped up, but we're not. So much richness in this discussion, and I do think we could continue for longer and should do a regular series of these vignettes. That's the purpose of this community of practice. But I think a couple of themes have jumped out at me in terms of what we've heard about what's starting to change. So some of the relationships that institutions have with partners, some of the roles and responsibilities between intermediary organizations and local organizations, some of the programming starting to be more demand driven. We heard a lot about advocacy efforts, especially with funders to change their ways of working and endorse the principles, and also local governments and different levels of governance. And we heard from the UK a full suite of new initiatives to support different models of locally led adaptation and aspects of locally led adaptation. But we heard a lot of consistent challenges and thorny problems. Getting that flexibility to be able to be demand driven is very much a challenge. The policy coherence issue is definitely a challenge as well. The issue that Sheila just brought up about the risks or perceived risks of decentralizing funding decisions, and you know, and some good examples at how we might start to chip away at those perceptions and continue to build that trust, because that's what's so critical in this is that there's trust at all levels, and that takes time to build. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you to our wonderful partners and colleagues at IIED and Gobeshona for hosting this dialogue. We hope this will be an annual feature, and not just at Gobeshona, but throughout the year, that we'll come together and really chat about what's working and what's not, and give each other suggestions. So that's what our aim is. We'll put our email IDs into the chat box. If you want to learn more, please do get in touch. If you want to be a part of the community of practice, or your organization wants to endorse the principles, you are most welcome, and please do join in. So with that, thank you. And
Thank you.
please do attend many other sessions on locally led adaptation at Gobeshona. And we also have sessions at MENA Climate Week.